This channel has been home to several series and videos over the past 5 years of running it, but lately I've been known as the Iceberg Guy. This was due to a mega project involving an iceberg on every single commuter railroad in the Northeast becoming too lengthy and was split into a several-part series, thus providing me with enough icebergs for the year. But after making each iceberg, I would eventually stumble across a few points of interest from these railroads that didn't make the original iceberg, with some of these entries being added as a pinned comment to the respective railroad's iceberg video. Over time, I would find more and more wordy entries, and more people would ask me if I would include these fun facts in a second iceberg of sorts. So now, instead of reading pinned comments, all these newfound feats and more are now compiled into one video. But as I was editing this video, it was becoming evidently clear that one particular railroad stood out with the most new facts to be covered. And not to mention, what better way to celebrate a landmark 5-year anniversary for the channel than to look back towards my roots by once again highlighting my home railroad. So with all that out of the way, after almost 4 years after the original, it's time for another round of obscure facts about the largest commuter railroad in the US, in the long-awaited Long Island Railroad Iceberg Part 2, Expansion. LIRR branches in ridership. Boasting a population of over 3 million people, including myself, Long Island is home to the largest and busiest commuter railroad in North America, with 11 branches and a daily ridership of about 300,000 people. These statistics help place it above every other commuter railroad in the country due to the high density of Long Island, as well as excellent frequencies for centuries. It is because of the railroad's variety of branch lines and constant daily service that millions of people rely on it to commute from the countless suburbs of Long Island to New York City, and everywhere in between. LIRR is the oldest continuously working railway in the US. In addition to being the largest and busiest commuter railroad in the US, it also just so happens to be the oldest railroad to be operating under the same original charter, with the oldest in the world being the Middleton Railway in the UK. Recently celebrating its 190th anniversary in 2024, the Long Island Railroad was chartered in 1834 along the present-day Atlantic Terminal Brooklyn branch between Atlantic Terminal and Jamaica, before later extending to Greenport to provide ferry service to the New Haven Railroad in Stonington, Connecticut. In fact, to this day, the LIRR uses the words railroad in its name, since its charter predates the use of railroad as one word. But throughout the different ownerships from the Pennsylvania Railroad and later the MTA, the LIRR still runs from its original charter to this day, almost 200 years later. Harold Interlocking. It would only make sense that the busiest railroad in the country would use the busiest interlocking in the country, as it not only sees switching moves from the countless LIRR trains on a daily basis, but it also runs in between various Amtrak trains running on the Northeast Corridor, the busiest intercity passenger rail line in the country. Just as complicated is immediately west of Harold, specifically F interlocking, where the Sunnyside Yard tracks merge with the LIRR and Amtrak main lines, now bringing these different railroads into the mix, with all three utilizing the 4 East River Tunnel tracks that access Penn Station. Even though some LIRR operations are made easier by simply reassigning trains to Grand Central Madison right before Harold becomes complicated, this interlocking will soon see service from Metro North with their Penn Station access service, thus adding a 4th railroad that has to navigate this web of switches. And better yet, most LIRR engineers have to memorize the track map of Harold interlocking in order to qualify. So to any of you out there who aspire to driving the train past this interlocking, good luck memorizing all this. Van Ritchie. You may not know him personally, but you do know his voice once you hear him say, "This is the train to Penn Station. The next station is Jamaica." This is the man behind the ever so iconic announcements used by the LIRR and Metro North on their M7s, C3s, and M8s, as other than manual conductor PA system announcements. This was the sole voice announcing upcoming stops and destinations on every train since 1999. As a New York native from Astoria, Van Ritchie graduated from Queensborough Community College in 1962 with a communications degree, where he would be used for other purposes such as PGA Golf Tour's image voice between 2005 and 2008, and more notably as a radio DJ in the Poughkeepsie area for 30 years, where he spent most of his life. Even though he unfortunately passed away in 2024, his legacy still lives on as the most recognizable voice on Long Island, as his voice can still be heard announcing what this is a train to and where it will be stopping at. Montauk Branch is the longest commuter line in the world. Coming in at a length of 116 miles from Penn Station, the Montauk Branch isn't just the longest branch in the IRR, going to the easternmost points in Long Island, and by extension the state of New York, but it also holds the title of being the longest continuous distance served by commuter rail in the US. Although, most runs on this branch aren't directly from Montauk to Penn Station, with most runs starting from Babylon, Patchogue, and Speonk, often with a transfer or two in between. Although, there are 2 direct trains that run from Penn Station all the way to Montauk, namely the Cannonball, a Fridays-only summer service that runs from Penn to the Hamptons, as well as 2 afternoon rush hour trains from Penn to Montauk, trains 14 and 20 as of when this video was made. FRA Inspection Train. Every year or so, the Federal Railroad Administration sends a modified inspection car across the country to thoroughly inspect the various conditions of the railroad it's traveling on, and the LIRR is no different. Usually, an FRA car is picked up with a diesel on each end, either a DE30AC or MP15AC on each end, or more recently one of each, and the car is toured around the railroad over the span of a week, with 2 or 3 branches being covered a day. Although this isn't too unusual of an occurrence for a commuter railroad, the LIRR does have an extensive history of several FRA inspection cars visiting the island over the years, including DOTX 216, a converted Metroliner cab car, 220, a one-off observation car built by Colorado Railcar, 221, a Brown ex-Canadian National coach, and 206, a converted U.S. Army hospital car. M7 Battery Conversion Proposal. As part of the battery-powered bandwagon in 2022, the LIRR considered converting some of their existing M7 and M9 EMUs to run on lithium-ion batteries in order to run direct service from the diesel branches to NYC. This way, the rail cars could run on third rail, where the third rail currently exists, and then swap to battery where there's no third rail, all with a 1-seat ride and no transfers, since the bi-level coaches used on the diesel branches do not fit in the 63rd Street tunnels leading to Grand Central Madison. And to showcase this premise, an M7 was towed to Oyster Bay for a press conference in 2022, which resulted in a rare move for Oyster Bay branch rail fans. But unusually, the LIRR decided to opt out of this program just 2 years after the announcement, as it was found that the use of battery power would not provide enough energy for the rail cars, as they instead opted for third rail expansion projects, which leads us to our next entry. M9A uses M7 shells. Technically in development well before the battery conversion pilot, the M9As have always been considered as an additional order to the existing Kawasaki M9s, which started service in 2019. After initial issues with the original M9 order, the MTA decided to swap the contract for the additional M9A order from Kawasaki to Alstom. But instead of using the previous M9 car body from Kawasaki, Alstom provided a modified version of the M7 rail car, this time equipped with a blue stripe on the exterior, front destination signs, and outlets at every seat, so basically trying to put an M9 inside an M7 shell. This is because of Alstom's acquisition of Bombardier in 2020, and with it Bombardier's catalog of railcar designs, so in order to have a competitive advantage against other railcar manufacturers, Alstom decided to offer an old yet familiar design for the MTA, resulting in a rare occurrence where a technically outdated design is selected as a successor railcar. Steam Up 39. Likely one of the most well-known pieces of preserved LIRR equipment, this slogan refers to the ongoing restoration of LIRR number 39, a G5 class steam engine built in 1929 representing the backbone of steam power on the island. 39 was the last steam engine in revenue service for the railroad, as it was retired in 1955 after a meetup ceremony at Hicksville with sister engine 35, which is also currently under cosmetic restoration at the Oyster Bay Railway Museum. After retirement, the Railroad Museum of Long Island has held several fundraisers over the past few decades to restore 39 to running condition, with current plans including its restoration at the Strasburg Railroad for tourist train service at Strasburg. You can help donate to the restoration of LIRR in the link in the description, as every little bit helps. Queenslink. One of the most noteworthy abandoned rail lines in New York City is the former Rockaway Beach branch, a former LIRR branch that split off from the main line at Rego Park and ran straight down to Rockaway Beach. The line was abandoned in 1962, as the section south of Ozone Park was given to the NYC subway to extend service on the present-day A train, while the segment north of Ozone Park was left dormant and became overgrown, thus creating a linear forest in the middle of dense houses. Currently, there is a group named Queenslink looking to restore service on the abandoned segment of the line by utilizing underground provisions to extend the M train from the Queens Boulevard line down along the Rockaway Beach branch and to connect with the A train. Not only do they propose bringing frequent subway service to parts of the city that see a lack of subway service, but they also plan to create a rails and trails environment, meaning a linear park would be built next to a newly reconstructed rail line instead of the right-of-way becoming only a trail. There is another link in the description to find out more info about Queenslink and how you can help their vision become a reality in order to help the lives of thousands of people in Queens and beyond. LIRR 101. Staying in Queens but going back to engines now, seeing that the LIRR is the busiest commuter railroad in the US, the railroad usually isn't keen of any engines or coaches that aren't in standard colors, which therefore makes this recent development all the more exciting. Originally built in 1977, 101 was one of 8 SW1001s acquired by the LIRR for various switching duties around Queens before being acquired by New York and Atlantic Railway for local freight duties in NYC. But in a surprise move in June 2025, 101 re-emerged from Nayar's Fresh Pond shops in its original as-built blue and white livery, as it was later revealed that NYAR ended their lease of the engine early as it went back into LIRR ownership. 101 can now be seen in Morris Park Yard alongside its sister SW1001s, along with a recent visit to RMLI's Riverhead Railroad Festival, as this is the railroad's first actual heritage unit in decades, ironically the first one since LIRR 102 and 104. 2 more SW1001s that were painted in the railroad's orange and gray World's Fair livery in the early 90s. LIRR 3100. The LIRR was already intriguing enough by using converted EMD F9s and Alco FAs as NPCUs on their opposite ends of trains powered by GP38 and MP15 freight engines. But as these oddities would later be replaced by more DE30s and C3 cab cars, as well as some M3s due to Ronkonkoma electrification, the LIRR shop crews still had one more trick up their sleeves. In the midst of this equipment shakeup was the introduction of the experimental C1 coach, which required head-end power when used for service to Long Island City, something the existing diesel engines by themselves didn't have. So to solve this issue, the LIRR took a recently retired Alco FA NPCU, removed the cab and repainted the sides, and placed it on the opposite end of the C1 set led by 2 GP38s, thus creating a custom B unit solely intended to provide HEP for the C1s. But alas, the service life of this one-of-a-kind creation would only be as long as the C1s that they powered, as 3100 was retired with the C1s in 1999 upon the arrival of the perfected C3s and DE30ACs, engines that could power HEP on their own without the need of a B unit. Interestingly, 3100 actually managed to stay on the roster in long-term storage in Morris Park until 2018, when it was finally sold as surplus for scrap, as this B unit is still sitting in Frontier Metal scrapyard alongside several retired M3s and cabooses as of when this video was made. One more thing to note is just before it was sent away to be scrapped, someone graffitied the side of 3100 with the black, white, and red of the Western Maryland Railway, thus paying tribute to 3100's original service life before going to the LIRR, specifically as Western Maryland number 304. Bar generator cars. Speaking of the crafty electrical engineering of LIRR shop crews, they decided in this case that one answer to bring HEP to the P72 coaches was to combine 2 unlikely aspects of passenger railroading: bar cars and generators. Specifically, 4 MP72T coaches were rebuilt in 1976 with massive generators that took up half the interior, while the other half was a bar lounge for commuters, as these cars were numbered 2101 to 2104 and were classified as the BG72B. Distinguishable by their large vents on one side of the car, these bar gens were intended to provide HEP to push-pull equipped coaches in trains that did not have an NPCU power pack unit or an MP15AC to provide head-end power. Although, the service life of these barge ends was short-lived, as the cars could not handle the extra weight of the generator, and the constant rocking of the train made the floors sag and pushed out the outer walls of the cars. And not to mention, generators also had the tendency to catch fire, which ultimately placed these cars out of service due to safety concerns. I guess a bar and a generator don't always mix that well. Hospital spurs. In addition to the tourist hotspots such as the Hamptons, Long Island is also home to some local urban legends, most notably a series of psychiatric centers which all saw service from the IRR at some point, usually in the form of materials or patients. These hospitals include Creedmoor in Queens, Kings Park State Hospital, Edgewood Hospital and Pilgrim State Hospital in Deer Park, and Central Islip State Hospital, the last of which had their own PRR-A3 shunter. Although all of these hospitals have since closed and with it their rail service, their abandoned structures still stand to this day, with the exception of Central Islip, with some remnants of these spurs still being seen at some locations. Lower Montauk Branch Restoration. When the IRR integrated fully high-level platform service in 1998, the one branch that didn't receive these station upgrades was the Lower Montauk Branch, a series of stations between Jamaica and Long Island City that were only served a few times a day by the Montauk Branch. With this massive gap, a handful of proposals have been brought up over the years to restore shuttle service on the line only between Jamaica and LIC, specifically in the form of Nippon Sharyo DMUs serving high-level platforms. The most recent of these proposals was brought up in the MTA's 20 Years Needs Assessment Comparative Analysis, where it's compared to over 30 different projects currently being considered by the MTA, with the project receiving mixed ratings for different categories due to its lack of connections to other nearby services along the Queens-Brooklyn border. Cedarhurst Cutoff. The Rockaway Beach branch isn't the only abandoned straight-line IRR branch near the Queens border that still has remnants, albeit there's nowhere near as much of this branch left when compared to the former of the two, nor are there any calls to restore it. Constructed in 1871, the line spurred off from the main line just east of Jamaica before going down to St. Albans and then bypassing Laurelton in order to go straight down to Cedarhurst before making a sharp right turn towards Far Rockaway Lockwood's Grove, just south of the Mott Avenue A train subway station. The line was operated by the New York and Rockaway Railroad, a Long Island subsidiary, in order to compete with the South Side Railroad's Far Rockaway branch by cutting straight across the marshes of the Queens-Nassau border. But despite its impressive construction, the line was abandoned in 1877 when the competing South Side Railroad was acquired by the IRR, with the original Far Rockaway station being relocated to Syosset before being demolished in 1948. As unusually, this branch then went through two more abandonments and rebuilds in its history. The line was rebuilt and electrified in 1908, but never saw revenue traffic other than some equipment moves before being torn up again in 1918, and was rebuilt and electrified again in 1928 to protect the ROW before the line was finally abandoned in 1934 due to redundancy with the present-day Far Rockaway branch. Even though the present-day branch serves more towns and sees more ridership, amazingly the ROW of the cutoff is still intact and can easily be seen from aerials, with all that remains from this line including bridge piers by North Woodmere Park, in addition to the active segment of the line between Hillside and Laurelton via St. Albans. Manhattan Beach Branch. The Lower Rockaway branch wasn't the only transit line that was shared by the IRR to go to a popular beach, as the railroad had a branch line of their own that went to the number one seaside attraction in Brooklyn, Coney Island, or at least the surrounding region. Established in 1877 as the New York Bay Ridge and Jamaica Railroad, it was one of several branch lines constructed to better connect the various regions of Brooklyn to the rest of the railroad, in addition to also serving a series of inter-Brooklyn services, such as the Culver Line from Culver Terminal to Smith's 9th Street, among others. Along this line, a branch would split off from the Bay Ridge Line and travel parallel to the BMT Brighton Line, built just a year after the IRR branch, stopping at the exact same stops as the subway line until Sheepshead Bay, where the line went straight down to Manhattan Beach. Even though the line was eventually abandoned in the late 30s, most of the abutments and right-of-way is still visible as they're located directly next to the B&Q subways, save the Manhattan Beach and Sheepshead Bay racetrack spurs. LIRR 1134 Whereabouts. This one just missed the original Iceberg, since I was still waiting for responses on railroad.net at the time of editing the original. Instead of having direct service from Wading River and Port Jefferson to all points west for most of its life, service between the two suburbs was served by a small gas-powered railcar that ran a shuttle service along the 10 miles between Port Jeff and Wading River, with stops at Miller Place and Rocky Point. The gas railcar in question was Brill Railcar number 1134, which also served on the Sag Harbor branch between Sag Harbor and Bridgehampton, but when service on these two branches was abandoned in 1938, LI-related info on the Brill Railcar serving the two lines vanished along with them. But its fate didn't end on Long Island, as 1134 was later sold to the Atlantic and Western Railway and was painted orange, as it became their number 7, where it ran between Sanford and Lillington, North Carolina, until some point in the 50s. At this point, its history really vanishes, as books about the IRR claim that this railcar was then preserved, quote-unquote, in a dilapidated state in a museum in Ohio, but it is not specified which museum this is, or if the railcar still exists to this day. So if anyone has any info as to where this missing Long Island railcar could be, please let me know in the comments. Lightweight parlor cars. There are certain things that makes a service become the flagship of a railroad: luxurious interiors, fun destinations, and cool consists. In addition to the heavyweight parlor cars known as the Blue Ribbon Fleet, a series of former Pennsy parlor cars and coaches repainted for the IRR's named passenger trains, the railroad would purchase a wide variety of lightweight coaches to replace the heavyweights. Specifically, they purchased surplus sleeping cars, sleeper lounge cars, buffet lounge cars, and tavern lounge observation cars in 1968 for use in parlor car service on named trains to Montauk and Greenport, with former railroads including Baltimore and Ohio, Erie Lackawanna, Florida East Coast, Kansas City Southern, New Haven, Pennsylvania, and Union Pacific. Even though these coaches would later be repainted into the standard blue and white, there was a brief point in the late 60s where all these coaches would be running in their original colors, thus resulting in quite the variety of liveries on one train, thereby adding a bit more fun to this already flagship service. The IRR film Alcoves on the Island does a great job representing this aspect of Long Island railroading, in addition to several other operations of the late 60s. No M3s to Grand Central Madison. Due to building the railroad's connection to Grand Central underneath an existing subway line into 63rd Street Tunnel, the railroad has to climb an incredibly steep 3.5% grade between 63rd and 48th Streets in order to get anywhere close to Grand Central. Unfortunately, this still puts the IRR tracks 160 feet below Grand Central's lower track mezzanine, hence the long escalators to the tracks. Ironically, because of the steep grades, the M3s, the railcar the project was initially built for, are unable to make the grade due to their weaker traction motors, while M7s and M9s can thankfully make the grade just fine. And just as well, since the railroad likely wants to use newer railcars for service to their brand new passenger terminal instead of M3s, which constantly get complaints from commuters due to their aging interiors. You gotta use the good stuff with the good stuff. Now, if only we could refurb an M3 with an M9 interior in blue stripes and call it the M9B, and no one will ever notice. We're pulling a Metra SD90 Mac with this one. Long Beach Miami Station. Long Beach is often seen as the affordable version of the Hamptons, in which people who don't want to travel too far from the city hang out here in order to enjoy the beach. This reputation was taken on by Long Beach so well that its station was briefly disguised as Miami, Florida in the 1959 movie That Kind of Woman, as quite possibly one of the most well-known instances of LIRR on the silver screen. This marks one of several instances where the LIRR cameoed in film media, or rather masqueraded as another railroad somewhere outside of Long Island, with other noteworthy examples including Sabrina in 1954, Sweet Liberty 1986, Sweet and Low Down 1999, and Muppets Take Manhattan 1984. Speaking of puppets, Southern Bread commercial cameo. Long before the Muppets, Kermit the Frog was made popular by a series of commercials for Wilkins Coffee, one of several brands under Jim Henson Productions, which also made commercials for other brands. One of said brands was Southern Bread, where Southern Colonial will do anything to proclaim how great Southern Bread is, but usually failing at said task. The commercials are thought to be the first examples of the Muppets filming on location instead of a studio, a precedent that will be continued with several more Muppets-related movies and TV shows. One of the first in this series of commercials aired in 1965, which involved a colonel trying to stop a train, with said train being an LIRR C-420, with him naturally failing to keep up to his claim. Luckily, no persons or puppets were harmed in the making of this commercial. LIRR Hallmark Christmas Movie. More often than not, trains are not the main focus of a movie, so in the past few decades, trains are rarely represented accurately to their real-life counterparts. This is usually done for convenience for filming or budgetary purposes, since an overall minimal percentage of the audience would notice these technical inaccuracies instead of focusing on other, larger aspects of the movie as a whole. Although, one of the largest misrepresentations of the LIRR in media would likely go to A Little Christmas Charm 2020, a Hallmark movie about a jewelry designer that finds a charm bracelet and teams up with a magazine reporter to locate its rightful owner by Christmas Eve. Part of the movie includes riding a holiday party train hosted by the Long Island Railroad Preservation Society, which runs on the classic LIRR route around the city. Although, no LIRR logos are used, nor is any LIRR rolling stock, as the decorated holiday train is led by Canadian Pacific 2860 at the British Columbia Railway Museum in Squamish, British Columbia, where several other pieces of decorated Canadian rolling stock can be seen, as the steam excursion pulls into the station, as it's being pushed by an off-screen diesel with smoke machines replacing 2860 smoke. And as insult to injury for the rail fans, the cover of the movie features a Rio Grande narrow gauge steam engine usually found on the Durango and Silverton in Colorado, both of which being locations nowhere close to the movie's intended setting of the greater New York region. Aluminum painted cars. Lighter surfaces reflect light, which in turn deflect heat. Although several cars were painted with aluminum roofs in order to take advantage of this feat by reflecting heat, notably with the Taichi livery, few rail cars were painted in aluminum in their entirety, with the exception of one. Also barely missing the original Iceberg, MP54 number 1725 was painted in an experimental all-aluminum livery in 1937 in an attempt to keep the whole car cool, as these painting techniques were used to deflect heat long before the days of air conditioning. Though there is a reason as to why this railcar remains a little-known experimental one-off, as this experiment was done during the same time as steam engines, whose soot and coal dust would frequently cover the otherwise clean car, thus making it darker over time. This in turn required increased costs in washing, which negated any cost savings in air conditioning, as the full aluminum experiment was not continued further, thus showing how advances in one field could result in drawbacks in another. Portable substation railcars. On a more successful note, going back to one of the earliest examples of the LIRR's signature creative electrical engineering, we have what could be the earliest, if not the only example of substations that can move on rails. In order to provide more electricity for increased seasonal service to the city, beaches, and racetracks, 4 railcars were constructed by American Car and Foundry in 1906 that contained 1,000 kilowatt rotary converters and 375 kilowatt air blast transformers, which were placed inside sheds built on a siding in order to be connected to the nearby electrical equipment that powered the rest of the branch. These railcars could be found at Springfield Junction, Belmont, Floral Park, and Hempstead Crossing, usually with 2 being in a shed or just outside it at a time, with these powerhouses on wheels often being used all the way until 1973, when they were last seen at West Hempstead, as these overlooked marvels in engineering are unfortunately presumed scrapped. Either that, or they somehow managed to go past the LIRR speed limit and reach 87 miles per hour, as they just might be out there somewhere in space and time. Electric rotary snowplow. As yet another example of Long Island electrical engineers flexing their muscles, they decided to purchase a third rail-powered double-ended rotary snowplow, quite possibly being the only example of such a rotary snowplow to ever exist, both in terms of being double-ended and for running on a third rail. Not much is known about this obscure entry in LIRR's extensive rolling stock, other than that it was constructed in 1905 when the railroad was acquiring a bunch of equipment to run on the then new third rail DC power, especially in the field of non-passenger equipment such as MP54 and MP41 baggage and mail cars. But in this case, I can only guess that the engineers on this project were so confident of their creation that they likely figured, we don't need no steam power to get us through the snow, we got our own unlimited power from the mighty third rail. Whether it performed better than the traditional steam engine or not isn't entirely clear, but I feel it would have performed incredibly thanks to the aforementioned third rail power boost, or laughably bad due to snow interfering with the third rail. The fact that we don't have more third rail powered snowplows since this one makes me assume the latter. Pannier tanks. Of course, it wouldn't be a rock block about quirky items on the all-time roster without some steam engine representation. Unlike saddle tanks, Pannier tanks have water tanks that extend all the way to the smokebox door and are almost exclusively found on a Great Western Railway in the UK, with classes such as the 5700s. Keyword being almost, as a small handful of other examples were used around the world, including what could be at least 2 on Long Island. The first of which, number 38, was built by Schenectady Locomotive Works in 1867 as a 440, a typical wheel arrangement for the time. As the engine was named Thurlow Weed and was mostly used on the Atlantic Division, it was noteworthy for its outside bearing pilot truck with fenders and equalizers, a highly unorthodox truck's design more akin to freight cars than steam engines. With an oddly similar design, the second engine, number 4, was built by Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works in September 1868, also as a 440T, as it was originally built for the New York, Flushing, and North Side Railroad before being bought up by the IRR in 1876, as it was renamed Newtown, with the railroad now making up the Port Washington and Whitestone branches. It's not entirely clear as to how many more Pannier tanks were rostered by the IRR, or any other American railroads for that matter, due to the design being almost exclusively unique to the Great Western Railway, but it helps that at least one American railroad has photographic evidence of such a design possibly being used elsewhere. South Ferry Station. Long before the days of Penn Station, several railroads would terminate right along the harbor where they would transfer the ferries that brought them to Manhattan, and the Long Island Railroad was no different. But instead of starting from the current Brooklyn terminus at Atlantic Terminal, the line would travel further west under Atlantic Avenue in the Cobble Hill Tunnel, where it would later re-emerge at South Ferry. Although, this grand terminus wasn't at South Ferry in Manhattan, as many wish it was, but rather in South Ferry, Brooklyn, a small dockside town between Carroll Garden and Brooklyn Heights, which once had ferry service to South Ferry in Manhattan, among other places. Built in conjunction with the tunnel in 1844, the double-track station only saw use until 1861, when the tunnel was closed due to a city ordinance that banned steam engines in Brooklyn, although the station itself remained without rail service all the way until 1916 when it was demolished, as the site currently sits at the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Speaking of abandoned tunnels in Brooklyn, BMT Franklin Avenue Line tunnel provisions. Hidden in the middle of the Atlantic Avenue tunnels are 2 square sections that curve towards the Franklin Avenue line, currently served by the Prospect Park S-Train shuttle. Although, these provisions weren't initially meant to connect with a subway shuttle, as the Franklin Avenue line initially connected with the Fulton Street Elevated for service from Park Row and the Brooklyn Bridge down the BMT Brighton line to Culver Terminal, present-day Sheepshead Bay on the B&Q trains. The provisions were constructed in 1903 as part of an agreement to place the IRR Atlantic branch underground in the event that the railroad would decide to host direct service from Atlantic Terminal down the Brighton line to, once again, Coney Island, or at least the surrounding area. Even though this provision was never constructed, the 2 tunnel entrances and corresponding third rail gaps can still be seen to this day on the south side of the branch just before Nostrand Avenue Station. Original Locust Valley Station exists as a house. Most stations nowadays are simply demolished to make way for newer, more modern buildings, but every once in a while, especially in more recent times, the original structure is moved for preservation purposes, which makes it all the more interesting that this somewhat new and otherwise common head house was moved and preserved all the way back in 1906. Just like Smithtown in the original Iceberg, the original 1872 station head house for Locust Valley was relocated not too far from the original station site as a private residence in 1906, after being replaced by the current station building. The design of the head house also looks similar to the present-day St. James Station, which still exists since its installation in 1873, as it serves as yet another example of this early LARR station house design, whose current address I shall not list out of respect for their homeowner. Green Lawn Third Rail Test Section. Despite several plans to electrify the Port Jefferson branch between Huntington and Port Jeff over the past few decades, with Green Lawn having a second track and platform, and with Northport having an empty second track as provisions, no third rail has yet to be extended to the end of the line at Port Jeff, for now at least. Although, there was one small segment of third rail that was constructed past Huntington other than their siding, as a sliver of third rail was constructed just west of Greenlawn Station in 1997. But given its short length, this wasn't used for testing full-scale electrification on the branch, but rather to test the third rail capabilities of the cheaper alternative, namely the dual-mode DM30ACs that ran in diesel mode outside of third rail territory. Even though the small test segment of third rail was removed soon after the DM30s entered service, it still serves as a brief example of a matter of circumstance and where test equipment also happened to be a minor feat in electrified territory. Freight gondolas on IRR MOW trains. Sometimes, desperate times call for rare moves at desperate measures. It was just another day, April 17, 2024, and the IRR was looking to do some routine maintenance on the Babylon branch. Typical consist for a move like this is one or more MP15ACs, and however many gondolas are needed depending on the type of work to be done. But for whatever reason, even though the railroad had the two MP15s at the ready, specifically numbers 163 and 165, they instead decided to tow a C&D trash gondola and a CSX gondola, both of which being freight cars exclusively used on the island by New York and Atlantic Railway for freight service. It's still unknown as to why this run was done with these two cars specifically, but this marks one of a few, if not the only instance, of IRR utilizing revenue freight cars since its freight diversion was spun off to NIAR in '97. Other recent mismatches of IRR and NIAR equipment that happened within the past few years include NIAR Jeeps being used for a welded rail train in Mineola, an IRR MP15 being sandwiched between a NIAR GP38 and caboose with freight cars on a NIAR PTC test train, and LARR leasing a brand new CSX gondolas for MOW service on the Mitchell Secondary. Riverhead to Greenport Railroad. Several railroads were hit hard by the subprime recession in 2008, especially the MTA, who was forced to make several service cuts and even considered a few more on some of their larger services. One of the more severe ones was a proposal in 2010 to discontinue service on the Greenport branch due to extensive length and low ridership, with service only remaining during summer weekends. But then something interesting happened. In addition to the usual calls to keep service running on the line, several people on the North Fork drafted a plan to begin their own local railroad on the line, funded with federal grants from an intertown alliance which existed to fund commerce and emergency services. Peculiarly, the proposed railroad never had a name, but it would be based out of Riverhead and would utilize Bud RDCs to run between Ronkonkoma and Greenport. But eventually, the IRR agreed to keep service running on the line after some funding agreements were worked out, in exchange of non-summer weekend service on the branch being discontinued for just a few years. One thing that can be learned from this is no matter how suburban and auto-centric Long Island may be, this one instance at least shows the resiliency of Long Island commuters, as they aren't willing to give up any rail service that's been around for centuries. M3s owned by PANYNJ. There's no need to be ashamed to quietly ask a friend to borrow some money if times are tough, especially if you're the busiest commuter railroad in the country. It was the 80s, and despite the absolute madness of money making in Wall Street in the same city that the railroad served, the LARR and other commuter railroads were down on their luck and didn't have a lot of funding. Therefore, the railroad had to borrow some money from their good friend, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, also known for running the Pat subway, in order to complete their order of Bud M3 railcars. This resulted in several M3s to have lettering on their B end that states they were purchased by PANYNJ and were leased by the MTA, in order for the MTA to eventually pay back PANYNJ for the purchase over time, with this text still being seen on these M3s to this day. Although not too common, railroads borrowing money from other agencies in order to complete purchases isn't unheard of, with the most recent example including Amtrak borrowing money to purchase HHP-8 engines from Philip Morris, the same company that owns Marlboro. Experimental M1 and GP38 fronts. On the topic of unusual features of Buddy MUs, and as a part 2 of the Silver Streak M1 entry on the original Iceberg, 2 other experimental liveries were trialed on the M1s in the early 80s. The first of which was a simple bright yellow straight line across the front nose above the blue stripe, in order to increase visibility, with the other variants including yellow on the through door and driver's window, though neither of these liveries would be adopted in favor of the yellow stripe replacing the blue stripe on the front. Just as obscure as these two visibility improvements are the two experimental liveries on two GP38s conducted around the same time for the same purpose, as 274 was given a white V stripe on the short hood, while 275 was given a white rectangle on the short hood. Although, this did not immediately result in an updated GP38 livery, as their next livery with a yellow nose wouldn't be introduced until a good few years afterwards. M1s at TTCI. Speaking of M1s and front noses, a handful of these stored EMUs would enjoy their retirement in the early 2000s by being quietly sent over far outside of home trackage all the way to Pueblo, Colorado, specifically to the Transportation Technology Center Incorporated, now known as MXV Rail. This place is a federal testing facility designed for two things: test brand new rail cars and crash test old rail cars, or at the very least, use them as a basis to test new technology on them. In the case of the M1s, at least 3 of them were sent over in 2002, where some of the units had their driving cabs replaced with the then state-of-the-art crash energy management or CEM equipment, where they were used for a variety of tests with different equipment. Most of these tests involved ramming the M3s into a parked train, or to at least put them in big consists of said train to see how they performed under different amounts of force, as thankfully the M1s fared very well over the past 20 years, thanks to the CEM equipment that these M1s have been retrofitted with. Due to the exact number of M1s being sent over the years being unknown, this further adds to the mystery of the exact number of preserved M1s as of now, other than the 2 at Riverhead, but we do know that numbers 9614, 9441, and 9324 have been cited as crash test units in some FRA reports. VW Bus High Railer. Certainly one of the most unique and iconic pieces of non-revenue IRR equipment, the Volkswagen Type 2 Bus High Railer was used as an inspection car to transport crew and inspect tracks across the system, starting in 1960, as an interesting choice of a car of the times. Technically, these rail buses are not unique to the IRR, as Germany and Sweden also roster a few VW Type 2 rail buses called the Dreisine for similar MOW purposes. The IRR is likely the only American user of these vehicles as high railers, likely as an early form of using vans as high railers. Initially commissioned by the US Postal Service, these 4 inspection buses not only had rail wheels that popped out from underneath, but also a car jack in the center of the underframe that lifted the car to spin it around to change directions in the middle of the track. Thankfully, one of the 4 high railer VW buses would be purchased by a group of former IRR employees, where they would repaint it into the Tuscan red of the Pennsylvania Railroad as they would joyride it on some lesser used branch lines across the country, although the current status of this rail bus isn't entirely clear as of now, other than being in poor condition. American Freedom Train at Belmont. 1976 was the year to celebrate, as everyone was hosting several festivities to commemorate the 200th birthday of America, and of course, the railroads had their own way of celebrating this feat. In addition to practically every railroad having their own bicentennial livery, including the LRR, who made their red, white, and blue stripes a standard livery for the GP38s, Long Island would also host the American Freedom Train, a cross-country exhibit train containing 26 red, white, and blue passenger cars that showcased America's extensive history, all being led by one of 3 specially painted engines, Reading 2101, Texas Pacific 610, and Southern Pacific 4449. But unlike other stops on the tour, the AFT's New York City stop saw none of these 3 steam engines, due to steam power being banned from the tunnels in NYC, which they would have to pass in order to get to Belmont, with 2101 staying in Morristown, New Jersey for brief repairs before being sent all the way up to Selkirk, New York, just to go all the way back down to its next stop in Connecticut. So the Constance was towed by SW1001s from New Jersey through Penn Station and over to Belmont, where the Constance would be split up on different sidings from July 27 to August 1st, 1976, sadly missing the bicentennial by a month, thus showing how Long Island still manages to stick out somehow in railway history. C1s have the highest railcar capacity in the world. It's amazing how an overlooked detail and lack of attention given to a footnote in the greater history can sometimes lead to some massive yet unnoticed discoveries. In 1990, the IRR purchased 10 cars from Tokyo Car Corporation for trial service with dual-mode service with FL9s, finally allowing for a one-seat ride from Port Jefferson to Penn Station. This service was so successful that it ultimately led to the railroad to replace the entire diesel fleet with similar coaches called the C3, built by Kawasaki based on lessons learned from the C1, with one of the most notable differences being the use of 2x2 seating instead of the 3x2 seating offered by the C1s. But since the C1s offered 3x2 seating on each level, this gave them a maximum capacity of 190 people per car, which means that these 10 experimental cars currently hold the record for the highest capacity in a single rail car in the world. Although this claim could be challenged by the French VB2N coaches, which allegedly seated 250 people on 3x3 benches for a few years before said benches were swapped out, though it's hard to determine if said benches ever held the seating arrangement given the narrower widths of French rolling stock. Miraculously, these cars are still in service to this day, as at least 2 of them have ended up on the Keewatin Railway in 2024, after previously being used for various Iowa Pacific-owned tourist railroads in the States, as they can now be seen on bi-weekly passenger service between the Pass and Pukatawagan in the middle of Manitoba, Canada, thus giving this world record title to this hidden Canadian short line located in practically the middle of nowhere. Though this still serves as a personal win for me, since these cars were used exclusively on the Port Jefferson branch, which in turn means my home branch line was part of a world record that initially was held by the US, even if said record was done well before my time. 18-car Port Jeff ranch trains. Considering the high population of Long Island, it would only be natural for regular consists to be some of the longest of any commuter rail in the country, with countless trains usually having anywhere between 8 to 12 cars and still result in standing room only. In addition to these lengthy regular consists, the IRR could have also held the title of the longest commuter train in revenue service, as during the 60s, regular trains on the Port Jefferson branch had a whopping 18 cars on the consist. Although these services had long since been reduced to something more reasonable, with 8 cars being the current maximum for the branch's high-level platforms, this somewhat brief time of 18-car Port Jeff branch trains could possibly place it above the rest of the world as the longest commuter rail consist in revenue service, even beating out the 15-car consists of much busier suburban systems such as Tokyo and Mumbai. This is also another personal win for me, as it's my home branch that brings home yet another possible never-thought-about world record. Triple header DEDM EQ move. If you rail fan the Long Island Railroad long enough, you start to see a different but similar variety of equipment moves on the diesel branches, varying numbers of MP15s towing a varying number of DE or DM30ACs and C3 coaches. In recent years, more DE and DM30s have been utilized on these equipment moves instead of MP15s, thus allowing for quicker travel times and a bit more horsepower, and in turn, a greater combination of engines and C3s. However, no equipment move has been as legendary as the early morning of June 20th, 2023, where a whopping 3 locomotives were lashed together elephant style, or all forward-facing, specifically engines 508, 415, and 419, as they pulled 2 C3 coaches, thus likely being the only instance of a triple-header DE-DM30AC mix. What's even more unusual about this is that the lead engine of the move was running in electric mode as it was powered by the third rail, a feat that rarely occurs for the DM30s outside of the East River tunnels. Although it's not entirely known what this EQ move was for, other than to simply move engines around in Morris Park or Long Island City, it's not too often that these moves go up to Jamaica Station, as this brief appearance quickly became one of the rarest EQ move consists in Long Island history. NYC Subway TGC4 on LIRR. Speaking of rare moves in the city terminal zone, the railroad would borrow an inspection rail car from the adjacent NYC subway in May of 2021 in order to test the tracks on the soon-to-be-opened east side access between Howard Interlocking and Grand Central Madison, due to the tunnels being too short for existing inspection cars. Since the TGC4 is diesel-powered, it was able to move on its own without the need of the third rail, which resulted in an unusual transfer move by leaving Linden Shops just off the 3 train and then onto the Bay Ridge line, where it then made a right turn at Fresh Pond Yard onto the lower Montauk branch of Jamaica, and then reversed on the main line to Herald interlocking, where it finally tested the 63rd Street tunnels for east side access. Not only did this result in rare mileage for NYC subway equipment on the IRR main line, with this run marking the first time that subway equipment was used on the IRR since the R44 test runs in 1976, but it also marks an even rarer instance of self-propelled subway equipment on freight secondaries of the IRR. AAR inspection train. Speaking of rare mileage for inspection trains, some particular runs in the early 2010s would stand out when compared to decades worth of FRA visits and track inspections, as the Association of American Railroads, or AAR, would send over their track loading vehicle, number 110, along with passenger coach car number 100, in order to place a load test on the various rails of the IRR. This hefty rectangle on wheels, painted in the Pennsylvania Railroad-inspired livery, is a telemetry car which houses hydraulics that push the rails underneath it down and out, while the passenger car behind it houses all the testing equipment to measure deflections in the rail underneath. When compared to FRA inspection trains, footage of this unique rail car is scarce in general, let alone on Long Island, though at least one video of this test run on Long Island does exist somewhere, with this car only visiting the island supposedly at least twice. New York State Freedom Train. The American Freedom Train wasn't the only national excursion train that visited Long Island, as the much smaller and much lesser known New York State Freedom Train made various stops on the island between January 3rd and 31st, 1950, in order to celebrate New York State's various contributions to the nation's freedom, albeit just over a month later after 1949, which was the original year of celebration. Unlike the AFT decades later, this consist did not have its own dedicated engine, only consisted of 6 exhibit cars, and was only limited within the state of New York, although this did result in 20 different stops throughout Long Island over the span of a month, with these stops being the last ones on the tour. Each car was leased from the New York Central as they were painted in New York State colors of blue and gold, as relatively little info is known about this excursion run, as well as other state-specific freedom trains around the same time, due to their small size and nature. Greenport to Sag Harbor Scoot. Why choose between spending your Long Island East End summer on the North Fork of the main line versus the South Fork on the Montauk branch when you can do both? Thanks to a connecting track at Manorville, the railroad was able to run at least one shuttle train between their mainline terminus in Greenport and their original South Shore terminus of Sag Harbor, in addition to running trains east from Ronkonkoma to Montauk via the Manorville cutoff. Starting in the 1880s, a 2-car shuttle would run between the two towns once a day, in addition to some freight runs, so that passengers could transfer from the main line to the Montauk branch. This way, they could also get off at any stop between Eastport and Bridgehampton for service further east to Montauk, although some of these scoots also terminated at Bridgehampton until Montauk became a more frequently used terminus in 1927, with the scoot service ending sometime later in the 1930s, with the connecting track in Manorville lasting until 1949. Despite being a footnote among several shuttles in Long Island's extensive history, this also served as the railroad's only East End to East End service, thus being a rare early example of an inter-suburb service, if you will, in which it only connected the furthest-most communities on Long Island without going into a larger city center. Speaking of shuttles, LIRR M3 7-train shuttle. The good thing about having multiple forms of transit being owned by the same transit agency is that if one of them experiences service changes, said transit agency can easily make accommodations on the other methods that it owns, and in some cases, through more unusual ways than others. On January 19, 1991, the 7-train subway was partially closed for repairs east of Hunters Point Avenue, so naturally the MTA encouraged all riders to use the IRR for service between Hunters Point Avenue and Shea Stadium. But what makes this run unusual is that the railroad decided to host dedicated M3 shuttle runs for the service, which only ran directly between Hunters Point Avenue and Shea Stadium, likely with the Woodside stop in between, as they even went as far as to create a sign on the front saying LIRR Shuttle underneath the 7-train roll sign. This marks one of a few, if not the only instance, of the LIRR offering a dedicated shuttle service to specifically replace a subway service during an outage, even if only for one weekend, as it's a great example of how different divisions of the MTA working together can sometimes result in some local railroading history. LARR E60. Sticking to Queens for this entry is another one-time deal that resulted in making unusual history. As for 1 week only, the LARR somehow leased an Amtrak E60 for East River Tunnel Protect service. Usually, at least one engine would be parked somewhere around Harold Interlocking, constantly running as an emergency engine in case if a train nearby broke down. This duty was likely undertaken by SW1001s at the time, since they could fit into East River tunnels. But according to records showing leased engines on the railroad, the LARR decided to lease an Amtrak E60, number 959, between January 13th and 23rd, 1982, as their protect engine for the same tunnels. This was likely due to the E60 starting to become surplus on Amtrak thanks to the introduction of the more successful AEM7, as the E60 was specifically intended to pull EMUs if they were to get stuck in the tunnel. Given the short duration of this lease, with the seemingly little out of the ordinary by having an Amtrak engine technically within Amtrak trackage with seemingly no other modifications, literally no other info is known about this lease. No photos, no videos, just an entry in the leased engines log. But despite how brief this lease was, this engine was single-handedly the railroad's only 6-axle power in the entire roster, as well as the first overhead catenary-powered engine since the BB1s of Bayhead Yard. LARR SW1001 in New Jersey. Looking back at the script, the AFT entry kind of alluded to this particular entry, since SW1001s were used to pull the Constance from New Jersey to Belmont due to the short height of the engine class, but there don't appear to be any known photos of said move. What isn't usual about this photo is that it involves a light engine emerging from the Hudson River tunnels in New Jersey, as engine number 100 was brought over solo to rescue a broken NJT train on May 30th, 1987. This marks the only photographed instance of any LARR equipment used in revenue or non-revenue service while in New Jersey and on the Northeast Corridor outside of Sunnyside, not counting ex-LARR equipment used on tourist railroads, as this particular photo ultimately inspired me to make this part 2 in the first place. M1 move to Wilmington. Speaking of rare mileage on the Northeast Corridor, some M1s would be transported down to Amtrak's Wilmington shops for extensive maintenance, usually between a Conrail engine and caboose. It is unknown as to how many M1s were sent down to Wilmington over the years, or if other LARR equipment was also sent there for similar reasons, as only one photo of such a move occurring seems to exist online, taken by Michael Desoy at Philadelphia in 1979. Although, there is another photo of 2 M1s at Delaware car shops also located in Wilmington, Delaware, taken at an unknown date, as it was uploaded to Facebook by Edward Thornton, but what they were doing there also remains a mystery for now. Conrail reroute 1987. In what could quite possibly be the rarest move in Long Island's 190-plus year history, a handful of Conrail trains to Fresh Pond Yard were rerouted along the LARR main line between Harold Interlocking and Jamaica in February 1987, due to a derailment on the Fremont Secondary between Hell's Gate Bridge and Fresh Pond. Instead of going straight down from the Hell's Gate, this alternative route followed the Northeast Corridor to Harold Interlocking, where the engines ran around the Constance and led the train down the main line to Jamaica, before running around the train again, as they led it along the lower Montauk branch to Fresh Pond. Although, this wouldn't be the last time that Conrail would be on the island, as according to some Railroad.net forums, Conrail would host a series of test trains throughout the 90s that ran onto Long Island, some with LARR engines and some with well cars, in order to promote the viability of freight rail in the region, but no photos or videos of said runs are known to exist at this time. And another Conrail-related history, a private owner briefly purchased and stored Conrail Caboose 21165 in Sands Point, New York, just north of Port Washington, though it was likely not transported by rail, with said caboose now being found in the Allentown and Auburn Tourist Railroad. But nevertheless, these Conrail reroutes mark the only time a Class 1 has diverted freight traffic onto the LARR's passenger main line, a route which already rarely sees freight traffic as it is, as well as marking the only time any General Electric road engines were used on Long Island, with this simple weekend reroute causing several firsts for Long Island as a perfect way to wrap up this Iceberg sequel. And with that, we have finally included everything there is to know about the Long Island Railroad, at least in terms of leftover obscure fun facts about said railroad. Thank you all so much for staying with me for this slightly lengthy video if you made it this far. As over 10,000 words and 50 entries later, I felt there was no better way to celebrate my channel's 5-year anniversary than by paying tribute to my home railroad, and with answering the requests of most of my fans. Admittedly, some of these entries would have been better located in other layers of the iceberg based on how obscure or intriguing they are, but I ultimately decided on this order to stay within a certain theme, with 2 or 3 entries in a row staying within a general topic, such as back-to-back entries about quirky electrical engineering projects. It's fitting how this video and the original LARR Iceberg have so many entries, given the almost 200-year history of this railroad, and I can't wait to see what new chapters this railroad will continue to be writing based on its leagues of history. There's also the Leftovers Iceberg for all the other Northeast commuter railroads coming eventually, so stay tuned to look out for that one. I know I covered a lot in this video, but if there are any other Long Island Railroad related entries that weren't included in either this iceberg or the original, feel free to put them here in the comments. And as always, thank you again for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.